My passion for sort of the human conversation always leads me in the end to the next big story. I tend to see trends as coming out of the conversations that I'm having from this enormously eclectic group of people that I've always known. I want to welcome you to the 9th Annual Women in the World Summit. Well, I think the Women in the World Summit is very much like an issue of Vanity Fair. You have to have that sizzle, and you have to have pacing and a mix of things which will keep people hooked. Well, I think the most famous cover we did was the Demi Moore pregnant cover. It just was so enormous in terms of its impact. I swear to God, I mean, that cover, I don't think it still goes on.
Hi Tina, thank you so much for coming.
I think Tina is a mixture of a pioneer, an entrepreneur, and somebody who can just feel, breathe, smell, understand what's happening, what's coming.
Part of it is her energy, which is magnetic, and if you've been following her for a couple weeks, relentless.
Good evening, everybody.
She's always ahead of the curve. When she put on Women in the World, 9 years ago, it was ahead of the curve on women's rights.
You'd have to say Tina was fearless, like not afraid. She was just ready to go.
I just think she thrived on what all editors thrive on, is the pieces that they publish don't go, down the drain and get lost. They become the centers of conversation.
She's curious, and most people are not. Most people have their set of what they believe, and she's really permeable. So she's a listener.
Most intellectuals actually really have an affinity for trash as well, but they don't kind of admit it. Tina fearlessly embraces both the high and the low and attacks both with kind of equal passion.
I love eclectic, different kinds of people. I was happy to sit next to a business person, a prosecutor, a journalist. I just love getting the whole download from those people's worlds. I'm interested in other people's worlds. Well, I grew up in England. My parents were in the movie business. When I was 10, my father came home with the most exciting news any 10-year-old could have had in the 60s, which is, I can take you on the set of the Beatles film. My hero was John Lennon. All I wanted was John Lennon. But of course, true to form, it was Paul who was really nice to me. Because Paul was always a nice guy. He was sweet, like, oh my God, you don't look 10, you look good, I thought you were 15. And John completely and utterly ignored me. I was crushed, but at the same time, it was the most exciting day of my life. I went to a series of kind of posh boarding schools and was a big rebel. I was thrown out of school 3 times. It wasn't that I was taking drugs or, climbing over the walls to date, boys. It was really much more that I just was constantly questioning authority, and they just thought I was a pain in the ass.
I think she's just kind of naturally curious about everything, and I think at heart she's an intellectual.
Well, I got into Oxford at the age of 16, which was young. I mean, the whole canvas of Oxford for me was just so incredibly enriching to my life that it really opened me up in ways that I don't think it would have ever happened if I hadn't been there.
She's a very curious combination, actually, of enormous daring and courage and a shyness which is overwhelming.
I was offered a column in Punch magazine, which is a sort of humor magazine at the time. But one of the assignments that I was given was to investigate what it was like to be a go-go dancer for one afternoon in a bar in Hackensack, New Jersey, which I did. I was Union Jackie, and I danced on the tabletop and then wrote my column. But once I'd finished that, I thought, maybe I should be the one to be assigning the pieces.
I'd like you to meet Tina Brown, who's one of this country's best-known journalists. She's the editor of the Tattler, a lively, provocative magazine of high society. She calls it a comic book for the high society.
I was approached by an entrepreneur who had bought the Tattler magazine, which at that time was a sort of ailing, shiny sheet with a 200-year-old pedigree. So it had a great name, but had a staff of 10 and was sort of 10,000 circulation.
Tina came in, fired everyone, and just hired these brilliant kids. Most of them it was their first job as well. A lot of them had writing experience because they came out of Oxford or Cambridge.
We took it from being a sort of boring establishment, sort of sycophantic thing, to being a very kind of sharp, attitudinal sophisticated thing.
And it became a roaring success. It went from 10,000 circulation to over 100,000.
Of course, we had the biggest story, social story of the century, really, which was the rise of Princess Diana.
She was always absolutely dotty about Prince Charles, right from the word go. I think she pinned his picture above her bunk at school and was mad about him from the word go.
We followed that story, we covered that story, we owned that story, actually. And to the point that when the royal wedding happened, I was asked to be the co-anchor of the Today Show from London.
He likes glamorous women, Prince Charles. He's never been out with a dog.
She can articulate a certain moment with such precision, but also with a certain amount of comedy.
And then eventually, of course, it did so well that it was bought by Condé Nast magazines, which is how I became part of American Condé Nast, because Cy Newhouse, the chairman, came to London, fell in love with Tattler, bought Tattler, and I was suddenly in this big glossy stable of magazines with many other opportunities.
The lively and frankly irreverent British writer and editor Tina Brown has arrived on our shores to try and save the struggling magazine Vanity Fair.
When I took over Vanity Fair, it really was cratering. I mean, there were 12 pages of advertising. It was a source of scorn. I mean, people really made fun of it.
It had under 200,000 readers. There's absolutely no way in which you could succeed at that level, at any level, with only that amount of advertising.
When Tina does anything, she gets into the weeds and she does the research and she goes into the archives and she studies the thing that she's about to take on.
My first thing I did was to go in over the weekend with the art department and just redesign the magazine soup to nuts, back to front, from the contents page to the end. New, clean, classic, strong design. And I was looking around in this office for something I could put into my first issue, because it was like a couple of weeks, you know. And I came upon this fabulous cache of photographs by Annie Leibovitz, who'd been taking pictures, but somehow, for some reason, they weren't publishing these pictures.
It was a series of young comedians. No one knew who they were.
Pee Wee Herman hanging upside down, and there were pictures of, you know, Whoopi Goldberg in a bath of milk.
She hadn't done Colored Purple yet, you know, with Steven Spielberg.
And I said, we've got to do this. We'll call it April Fools, because it's April magazine.
Let's look at how you have changed Vanity Fair. How might People magazine have done that same cover? Or Vogue, or Cosmo?
They wouldn't have had the guts.
She didn't have that weight on her coming from, you know, from England, and just, you know, blew it apart. She really created Vanity Fair.
It took a year and a half for Vanity Fair to really click. The first 10 or 12 issues people thought were greatly improved. It was getting kind of nice reviews, but it wasn't sort of breaking through. And in fact, Cy Newhouse in June of 1985 came very close to closing it. And I suddenly heard that we'd been told we couldn't hire anybody. Well, we all know what that means. It means bad news. So I rushed back on the red eye and confronted Cy and said to him, look, I've got these amazing stories in the works. You've got to give me another 6 months. One of them was a shoot and an interview with the Reagans. It was a photo shoot that Harry Benson did. I went with him to the White House. And these pictures just became very iconic in Vanity Fair's history.
How did you persuade the Reagans that they needed to foxtrot across your cover?
Harry was brilliant at creating reasons why people would give him what he wanted.
Basically, I turned the map room into a studio.
And so he took with him a boombox to the White House, and he put up this big white screen. And as the Reagans came in, Harry Benson hit the boombox. Nancy, dressed in her long black Adolpho gown, looks at Ronnie in his black tie and says, "Oh, Ronnie, that's our song. Let's dance."
They put on Frank Sinatra singing Nancy with a Laughing Face.
The two of them, in this really magical moment, start to do this foxtrot together around the white screen, with, of course, Harry Benson jumping up and down with his camera, taking pictures. He's a crazy Scottish guy with, you know, toilet brush hair, saying, Mr. President, give your wife a kiss."
This was a sharp-looking couple who knew how to be photographed.
And the president leans in and gives this screen smooch with Nancy. And I'm thinking, the Reagan kiss, I have my, you know, this is going to be incredible. And it was.
That is steamy.
I knew it was good, but you never can tell.
Never seen a close-up of a president kissing the first lady before. I suppose we've always think they're They don't do things like that in the White House.
Well, I get the feeling they do it all the time in the White House, and in fact,
That became a cover that was viral before there was viral. You know, it was on every news show, every newsstand. Huge amount of press for Vanity Fair.
A friend of mine refers to Vanity Fair as high-class trashy.
That's me.
You don't mind that?
It's high-low. I mean, you know, she loves a combination of some deeply reported piece that always somehow happens to be incredibly newsworthy at the moment that it's published.
A piece I did actually about Princess Diana, which was called The Mouse That Roared, and it was the piece that broke the news that the marriage of Di and Charles was in serious trouble.
I remember her saying there's something wrong in the marriage there, because what she was getting from London was not the standard fare about Diana.
And the royal couple actually went on the BBC to deny it. And that is when I knew it was true, because the royal family only ever denies stories that are true.
I came in on the scene and I apparently could do no wrong. But it's quite interesting to see that the niggly things that go on now that I apparently perhaps could be doing wrong.
The last time I saw Diana, I had lunch with her at the Four Seasons in New York. And she said to me, you know, I owe you an apology. And I said, why is that? And she said, well, you know, you wrote that story and we denied it, but you got it right. I said, I know, ma'am, I know we got it right. But I just thought, you know, when you're a journalist, you have to ask those questions and you have to say what you know. Every film that I loved was Harvey Weinstein's. But of course, as soon as I went to work for him, I discovered that he was really a charlatan. I can't believe it. Keith Richards actually apologized to Mick Jagger for the first time. And whenever we're together, we spend the first 2 hours of the day having breakfast in the local diner and reading our news buffet. Interesting that he's done that.
He's absolutely top class.
We're just two journalists still who just love the business of journalism and media, and we exchange our views about what's happening in the world. It all got drowned in the other news.
To me, I get sustenance from it. I don't know what she gets except a headache.
I mean, it was so much news yesterday, we just didn't notice it.
I got swamped.
When I first met my husband, Harry Evans, he was the editor of the Sunday Times, which was the biggest, kind of most successful crusading newspaper in London. He was the kind of the Ben Bradley of London, if you like. And I had this interview with him, but when I arrived, he had no time for me because Harry always runs late. That's one thing I've learned.
I'm busy with the next edition of the Sunday Times, and the door opens and there's this woman, this young woman.
And I could see from a distance that there was Harry, surrounded by all of these news editors, laying out the front page of the newspaper.
I just said, don't bother me now. I was furious with my secretary, and she said she just pushed her way in.
And zing, zing, zing went my heart because he had these incredible blue eyes. He had no time for me, which I thought was incredibly sexy. And it was just, for me, love at first sight.
Everything Tina does, he wants to be a part of. And everything Harry does, Tina wants to be a part of. I don't think Tina would exist, frankly, without Harry.
I think both of them have been so devoted to telling stories that are really cover the gamut from the high, the low. In terms of women in media, she was one of the first to really take on the role of being the boss and used her platforms to spotlight women's voices. So Women in the World, Diana Chronicles, Vanity Fair, the iconic Demi Moore cover.
And that cover took us from 800,000 circulation to 1.2 million, and it never went back down. It just was so enormous in terms of its impact that it created a whole new audience for Vanity Fair. I had just had my second baby, and I'd spent 9 months in maternity clothes, as it were, and I was feeling like rebellious and mutinous of that.
She'd been pregnant with me for some time, so when I came around, I think she just was ready to, go all out, just embrace every element of being pregnant and showing it off to the world, and that with Annie Leibovitz's genius and then Demi Moore being game, I think led to this iconic moment, which is very cool.
Annie had the opportunity to photograph Demi Moore for the cover, and she was pregnant. And so usually at that time, a star pregnant would be photographed from here. And I said to Annie, why don't we photograph her showing the stomach? in a tight dress. I had been looking for a cover that would sort of turn the mood from the sort of 80s right into the new 90s feeling of a slightly fresher era. And the wonderful thing about Annie is she always goes further than you ask. Always. So she comes back with the pictures, and they're great, Demi in her dress and so on. She said, but there is this other picture that I took, but I really did it for just Demi and Bruce Willis. And I said, well, show me it. And then I saw the picture of Demi naked and pregnant in all her glory. And I said, Annie, we just have to have this for the cover. This is the cover.
Here she's on the cover of another magazine, embarrassing herself naked with child.
I like that picture.
Yeah.
Walmart told the circulation department on no account would they have this cover. It was just indecent. It wasn't going to happen. So, not to be defeated, we decided to shrink wrap the magazine like a porn magazine. And we put it in the porn stash. And it just doubled the heat.
It was provocative. And then I think the importance of it, came afterwards. We didn't really know, how important it was till we did it.
I swear to God, that cover, I don't think, it still goes on. The cover 20 years later, 25 years later, when that bulge has already been to Brown University, graduated, and I don't know what she's doing these days, but it is a long time ago. But everybody since, stars who are pregnant since, all want to do their Demi Moore shot. In 92, I had my old restlessness. I'm very restless. I created the success of Vanity Fair. It was wonderful, but I kind of missed my literary roots. Cy Newhouse had bought The New Yorker, which had been one of his great passions. He changed the editor, the legendary editor William Shawn. He installed another editor, but it didn't work. And I looked at what he was doing at The New Yorker, and I thought, I know how to fix The New Yorker.
Now, The New Yorker, of course, when she moved there, that's more my territory. And I thought, oh, wow, this girl is something. She can do that, too.
There's no question that when she came along in the early 90s to The New Yorker, she woke it up. She injected it with some sense of the now.
It was much more about polishing a jewel and carefully realigning it so that you kept the great things about its pedigree, but you did bring it into the 20th century.
Each issue of The New Yorker, in her mind, had to have something that you read while you still had your coat on and you've just thrown your keys in the bowl and you're still standing at the doorway.
And she saved that magazine. Thank God.
Well, at the end of nearly 7 years, I was very passionate about expanding The New Yorker's radius. I wanted to make The New Yorker into a book company, literary festival, TV, radio show, and so I didn't want to do it. So at that point, Harvey Weinstein of Miramax Films just came to me and said, I love what you're doing. You should have a magazine that's also movies, books, TV. It was everything I had wanted to do. And he said, you can be, instead of being an employee, you can be a partner, you can be an entrepreneur.
Talk Magazine celebrated its first issue last night with a glittering party at the Statue of Liberty.
The attraction for her was of something completely and utterly new and self-created. That was liberating to her. Fun, exciting, scary.
Well, I think we've produced a new magazine for the new century. It combines the immediacy of a news magazine with the depth of a monthly.
If you ask me what the best thing Tina's done in her career is, I would say it was Talk Magazine. It was brilliant, at least the first probably 2 issues. And then it started to go south.
At that time, Harvey Weinstein was producing Shakespeare in Love, The English Patient, My Left Foot. All of these wonderful films. Every film that I loved was Harvey Weinstein's. But of course, as soon as I went to work for him, I discovered that he was really a charlatan. I made a huge mistake.
Harvey Weinstein hadn't a clue what it should be. He kept saying, why isn't it more like Vanity Fair? She said, that's the whole point. We don't want to be Vanity. I've done Vanity Fair. I don't want to do Vanity Fair.
It was horrible to discover that after having left a wonderful job in a wonderful company, to realize that I had been, frankly, snookered by someone as disreputable as Harvey, and I just had to live with it. He'd never sexually harassed me, but I got every other kinds of belligerence and profanity, and, he was a nightmare to work for.
And Talk Magazine is folding 2 years after its much-hyped debut.
It was a very sad thing for me when Talk folded, and having to kind of live with the idea it was, quote, a failure, but actually I always thought it was a creative success.
If you're in the game for a long time, you're going to have a flame out, as I say, and I've had mine.
I was completely sucked into her energy field and fell in love with her.
I'm Tina Brown, and this is Topic A.
Congratulations, Tina. I've never seen a book go to first, #1 on the New York Times bestseller list immediately.
This is about a thriving, vibrant, young website that launched only 2 years ago.
Newsweek, one of the oldest names in publishing, joins forces with 2-year-old news and opinion website, The Daily Beast.
Newsweek, at least the print version, is going away in 2013.
Doing the Daily Beast, I was also serving on the as a board member of Vital Voices, which is a NGO that mentors women in emerging countries. And I kept meeting these incredible women from Africa, India, and the Middle East who were just firecrackers. I mean, women who had faced down oppression and child marriage and honor killings and no education. And I just thought these women are so incredible. I really wanted to give them voices.
Well, I think Tina's commitment to women and to feminism is deep, genuine, and long-lasting.
I love doing live events and always have. I did them at the New Yorker and at Talk. And I said, let's start a live event for these women. We'll call it Women in the World.
And I remember when it started, there were, I think, 200 people in a basement theater in Midtown New York.
The very first Women in the World event was a play. And the really wonderful thing about it was that we portrayed these activists. I was embodying the words of Inez McCormick.
What did it feel like to be portrayed by Meryl Streep?
She's much better at being me than I am.
And Tina had arranged at the end of the evening, all the real activists were in the audience and they came up and they stood with us, and it just took my breath away, some of the people that I met. And I think it really, it lodged in me a desire to work with her on this.
And the whole philosophy of Women in the World is to engage with the world through story and to tell those stories through the eyes of women, because behind the lines of the news, you never really hear what women think about any of it, or what they're doing, or how it impacts them. We've been a platform for women of courage, women who risk their lives as well as their reputations to resist oppression and confront cruelty.
Each year it's gotten bigger. She's invited more and more leaders. It's high-low. It has every kind of conversation you can imagine from women.
I remember one very moving moment when women from Rwanda went on stage and explained how they worked on the reconciliation of the country. Those stories were so moving that eventually, a year later, I went to Rwanda and I wanted to see for myself what it had been like, and the story on stage was just exactly what I saw in reality in the country.
I really wanted to develop Women in the World as a major platform, because I'd felt the beginnings of a global women's movement and I could see it pushing out. And, we've really taken the summit completely global.
Can you tell us in how many countries fresh paper is sold?
Yeah, well, we started at a farmer's market, and through word of mouth, in just over a year, it spread to over 35 countries now. When I went on stage at Women in the World and shared my story, the minute I walked off and went backstage, I knew that everything had changed, and nothing really was ever the same again.
I mean, I buy her stuff now. So everybody, it sort of gave an opportunity to a lot of different women, and money flowed.
After having doubted myself for years and years, just being in that room with these women that were doing incredible things left me with so much inspiration.
That women's movement that excited me, that was taking place in Africa, India, and the Middle East, has somehow kind of come around backwards, as it were, back to the United States. So you've seen this explosion of a women's movement here, as you saw with the Women's March, and then, of course, in the latter half of last year, the Me Too movement. And it's an amazing thing to see how all of that energy has kind of caught fire. And we were at the beginning of it in 2009.
I admire her very much for consistently, putting all of her energy in this direction, the direction she's chosen now.
We're here now. Women are in the world, and we will not be bullied.
What's remarkable about Tina is that she's this incredibly visionary leader who uses her tremendous influence to amplify voices that would otherwise probably not be heard.
Whether it's a magazine issue or a television show that she's doing or Women in the World, there's a real antipathy of boredom. She will not have that.
I mean, I was completely sucked into her energy field and fell in love with her.
I love her, and I've loved her such a long time. It's part of my being. She's just amazing.
I think I'm going to look back on Women in the World as a really important piece of social entrepreneurship in my life that really might turn out to be one of the most important things that I've done.